Welcome to lecture for psychopathology. We'll be talking this time about anxiety disorder. So moving on to talk about panic disorder. And before we talk about panic disorder, we have to talk about the DSM criteria for a panic attack. And you won't diagnose somebody with a panic attack, but when we talk about panic disorder, we talk about the presence of panic attacks. And in those criteria, it doesn't define what a panic attack is. The DSM defines it elsewhere. It does it for ease of trying to limit some of the redundancy, because you can be diagnosed with panic disorder with agoraphobia, panic disorder without history of agoraphobia, two separate things, both of which having panic attacks. So instead of having to describe panic attack twice for both of those disorders, or every time you talk about it in one of the phobias, you define it separately, but again, you won't be diagnosed with a panic attack. You'll be diagnosed with a panic disorder, or a specific phobia, or a social phobia, or PTSD, or any of these other things that panic attacks can occur in. But again, this is not a diagnosis, it's just kind of definitional. Okay. A panic attack is a discrete period of intense fear or discomfort in which four of the following symptoms develop abruptly and peak within 10 minutes. Okay. So it's not just one symptom, it's at least four, usually it's a whole cluster. And it doesn't build slowly like watching a movie, it's boom, ramping up rapidly, and then you don't stay at that heightened level of panic, largely because your body can't, right? And it won't let you, right? You've got your nervous system with your autonomic nervous system with your sympathetic and parasympathetic. Whenever your heart rate shoots up and adrenaline's going do to originally your body does that, or is designed to do that, to get away from the bear. The other part of your nervous system will come down and say, "Hey, bear's gone, slow down. It's good, relax." Because if you don't, your heart will explode, and your body won't let your heart explode. Nobody's heart explodes, right? It's a beautiful design. For that reason, because of the role of the parasympathetic nervous system, the symptoms peak and they come back down, right? And it's not that I'm perfectly calm, but symptoms aren't as pronounced. They can only get so high and stay for a while, and then they will come down. Even if you don't run away or fight, if you're stuck being scared, your body will still calm down. Okay. So the symptoms, that's kind of weird. We have physical symptoms. Accelerated heart rate, sweating, trembling, shaking, shortness of breath, feeling of choking, chest pain, abdominal stress, feeling dizzy, paresthesias, which is that feeling of pins and needles, like when your hand goes to sleep, if you fall asleep on it, chills or hot flushes. So you have a bunch of symptoms that are very kind of physical symptoms, many of them similar to what people expect a heart attack to be like, and not uncommon for somebody when they have their first panic attack to think they're having a heart attack, right? Because of that chest pain, the shortness of breath, like, oh geez, I'm having a heart attack, oh my gosh. It's a panic attack and it'll go away. Of the 13 symptoms we talk about, a substantial chunk of them are physical symptoms, and then 9, 10, and 11, 3 of them are more emotional, cognitive symptoms, right? Fear of losing control, fear of dying, and derealization or depersonalization, right? Feeling that the world is not real or that I'm not real in it. Right? So the fear of losing control, we can understand, well, yeah, if stuff's happening, that makes sense. Fear of dying, yeah, I think you're having a heart attack. And then the derealization, depersonalization, this is where we have, those are aspects of dissociation. So people can experience a little bit of zoning out of their reality during a panic attack. And it's not for an extended period of time, it's a brief period of time where things are so intense, the mind starts to check out and it's like, whoa, I'm floating above myself, this isn't real. And then you come back to where you are. It's probably a protective mechanism of the mind. Okay, so panic disorder includes both 1 and 2. 1 being recurrent, unexpected panic attacks. Panic attacks as defined, like we just said, elsewhere. So more than one. You can't just have one panic attack and have panic disorder. And they have to be unexpected, right? Well, what's an expected panic attack? Well, an expected panic attack, also called acute panic attack, is what you have if you have a phobia, right? Or possibly PTSD, where there's something that whenever I'm near this, whenever I see this, when I think of this, I have a panic attack. Okay, well, it's related to this target, this trigger in the world. And if it's something that's triggered, it's not unexpected. Panic disorder is in some ways scarier because there's not an identifiable trigger. Out of nowhere, things are going along fine. Life may be stressful, but there's not a dog barking that you're scared of. You're not about to go on stage. You're just sitting at work, or you're driving in your car, and oh my God, my heart's going, my can't breathe, I'm sweating, palpitations, da da da. Right? Imagine it would freak you out. It's unexpected. And people with panic disorder may have some cued panic attacks. So you could have specific phobia and panic disorder. So if you're afraid of dogs and panic attacks when you see them, and you have some unexpected ones, you might have both. Right? You may have panic disorder and specific phobia. But to have panic disorder, some of your panic attacks, more than one, have to be unexpected. Come out of nowhere. Okay. And so it's not just that. And at least one of the panic attacks that you have is followed by 1 month of one or more of the following. Right? So it's not just having panic attacks, it's having panic attacks and then afterward you're different for a while. And it could be persistent concern about having another panic attack. Right? It's a scary thing. And if you go, wow, that was scary, oh, but I'm okay now. And then for a couple days you're like, well, no, that didn't happen again. And then you shake it off and you're fine. When you stop thinking about it, it's not panic disorder. Right? Has to be at least a month of being worried about it, or worried about the implications of it. Again, for a month, wow, what does this mean? Am I going crazy? Is something wrong with me? If you just worry about that for that day, for a week, and then blow it off, not panic disorder. So it has to be more intense enough for you to worry about it for a while, or a significant change in behavior related to the attacks, right? Which is usually some sort of avoidance, right? You stop going out because you're afraid of having panic attacks, or you start drinking to keep from having panic attacks. But something in your behavior is significantly different because of the attacks. And again, for at least a month. One of the things that could be different is avoiding situations where you might have a panic attack. Right? If you do that, then you might have agoraphobia, right? And I have here the presence or absence of agoraphobia, because in the DSM you can be diagnosed with panic disorder without history of agoraphobia, or panic disorder with agoraphobia. And if it's without history of agoraphobia, then criterion B is the absence of agoraphobia. If you have panic disorder with agoraphobia, then criterion B is the presence of agoraphobia. Otherwise, all the criteria are the same. That's why I've condensed those two diagnoses into one list here, with just you swap out criterion B if agoraphobia is there or not the others. And we'll talk in a minute about exactly what agoraphobia is, because again, it's defined in the DSM just like panic attacks are defined. The panic attack is not due to a substance or general medical condition, right? So it's not that you take some meth or get some bad weed and you start tripping and you have this panic attack. You're not intoxicated, and it's not something wrong with your hypothalamus that's causing these symptoms, right? Which can happen. So it's not explained by something medically wrong with you, some other medical condition, or substance. And the panic attacks are not better accounted for by another disorder. And this is, again, typically whenever the panic attacks are cued in specific phobia or with PTSD. Okay, so the DSM also sets out criteria for what agoraphobia is. Again, it's kind of where mostly it's just because it's defined. So if you're saying somebody has panic disorder with or without agoraphobia. Now, in very rare instances, technically you could be diagnosed with agoraphobia without history of panic disorder. And all that means is it's just like agoraphobia with panic disorder, except you've never had a full-blown panic attack, right? So you still have this kind of all these avoidance behaviors that we'll talk about, but it's fear of having these panic-like symptoms rather than fear of having a panic attack. So, but agoraphobia most often occurs with panic disorder. It involves anxiety about being in places or situations from which escape might be difficult or embarrassing, or help might not come when you panic. Right? So when you have a panic attack, remember for panic disorder, you have these unexpected panic attacks, and afterward you have a month or more of worry or change in behavior, and that may include agoraphobia. Right? So after you've had these panic attacks, you begin to think, geez, what's going to happen? What if I'm driving and I have one and I'll lose control and I can't only control the car and I get to crash? So you don't drive anywhere. Right? So escape would be difficult or embarrassing. Oh, what happens if I have one of these while I work and everybody looks at me and they stare and they laugh? So then you don't go to work. You avoid those situations or places because it'll be embarrassing. So it's going to be difficult to escape, or people might have to help you if that happens. If you have anxiety about that, that's part of agoraphobia. So you have anxiety about it, and then you avoid those situations. Or you endure them with marked distress. Or another option, thirdly, you could endure them with the presence of a companion. Like, so you will only go out in public if somebody goes with you. That way, if I have a panic attack, they can take the wheel, they can get me somewhere safe. Again, it's just the idea that you don't feel able to do things on your own or go places because of the fear of having panic attacks. And again, the anxiety is not better accounted for by another mental disorder, like social phobia, specific phobia, PTSD, OCD, something like that. Okay. So, experience of panic disorder in terms of onset and prevalence, you're looking at somewhere between 1 and 5% of people in their lives will be diagnosed or meet criteria for panic disorder. But if you look at, so that's like general population. If you look at people that are seen in mental health clinics, you've got up to 10% of people in the clinics are going to have panic disorder. But then if you look at medical specialty clinics, cardiologists, endocrinologists, people like that, it makes up between 10 and 60% of people going to those clinics, depending on what clinic you're looking at. And that's because people, when they have panic attacks, usually they assume it's something medical. They assume it's something wrong with their heart or some sort of hormonal imbalance. So they don't go see a counselor or a psychologist. They go to a doctor. And then sometimes doctors will refer them on to therapy if they diagnose it properly, which is probably good anyway, because you want to rule out any kind of organic cause and make sure that it really is a panic attack and not a symptom of some medical condition. It's twice as common in women than compared to men in terms of diagnosis. Most of the evidence, when you look at it, it's probably not because of biological differences between men and women, more likely social differences in terms of willingness to acknowledge having panic symptoms. Men might be less likely to disclose that. Onset, typically late adolescence or early adulthood. Looking at comorbidity, about half of the individuals with a panic disorder have it with agoraphobia. The other half obviously have it without agoraphobia. Other anxiety disorders are often comorbid, like generalized anxiety disorder, which we'll talk about, as are substance abuse disorders. But the most common comorbid disorder is major depressive disorder. About 60% lifetime of people having both of those. People with panic disorder, sometime in their life, will meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So over half. It's not clear if, looking at depression and panic, if one typically precedes the other. For some people, they'll have the panic symptoms first in their life and then later develop depression. Others will have the depressive symptoms first and then later develop the panic symptoms. I talked about you have to have these unexpected panic attacks and not cued. So the unexpected panic attacks are required for diagnosis, but somebody may also experience cued panic attacks, right? So if they had a panic attack, at their office Christmas party, and now they have them when they're at parties, then it becomes kind of cued, but they had it unexpected before. And you may consider an additional diagnosis of social phobia, right? If they're really worried about being negatively evaluated, and it's not just that they avoid parties because they're afraid of having a panic attack. If being in a party setting increases their anxiety, so if they have an anxious response to going to the party, then that social phobia, you may add it again. And that's where your clinical judgment comes in. If you think it makes sense and adds to the clinical picture and tells you more about the person, or if you think panic disorder is sufficient, then you leave it at that. Okay. In terms of are there different types of panic? There's some evidence for two qualitatively different types of panic attacks. Looking at cardiorespiratory distress, people that have more of the breathing and the heart and the chest pain types of symptoms, and other people reporting more prominent in their experience dizziness-related symptoms. If one type is predominant over the other in an individual, and some people have both those types of symptoms, but if one type is more prominent than the other, then this may have implications for treatment, but it's still an area for future research to consider. Nocturnal panic, this is interesting. About 40% of people with panic disorders will experience one or more nocturnal panic attacks. So while this isn't just nocturnal in terms of at night, nocturnal as in they're asleep, right? And they occur during the part of sleep that's not associated with dreaming. Right? So it's not a nightmare. Different ideas about this. It's possibly a surge in arousal that happens in everyone. You know, that when you're sleeping, you have these kind of increase in brain activity. But that people prone to panic, that, in some level our brain misinterprets it as something bad is happening. This is kind of also just a reminder to you that just because you're asleep doesn't mean you're not thinking. Your brain is still working, even if you're kind of in a different state of consciousness. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the etiology of panic disorder. Let's start with talking about the fight or flight response, fight or flight system, because the experience of panic that occurs in panic disorder involves the same neural structures and pathways that are used in the adaptive fight or flight response. Remember, that's the body's way of preparing for danger. When the bear's coming to get you, your body fires up the sympathetic nervous system, and adrenaline is released, and your breathing speeds up, heart rate speeds up. You're pumping more blood to your muscles to get ready to either fight the bear, probably a bad idea, or run away. And all these kind of physical things are happening, preparing you to save yourself. It's an adaptive thing. It's good, right? The problem is, with panic disorder, somehow the system's going off, it's being activated, when there isn't a clear and present danger. Remember, there are these unexpected panic attacks. There's not something immediately there out to get you, and out of the blue, the system's being turned on. Most explanations for why this happens, why the system gets turned on when there's not a clear and present danger, involve a diathesis stress model, right? And a diathesis stress model, psychopathology, which is used to explain the etiology of many disorders, is the idea that there's some vulnerability, a diathesis, that's manifested given the right conditions, and the right conditions being stress, or stressors. And remember, not all people that experience panic attacks develop panic disorder. If you have a panic attack and then it doesn't really bother you, you don't worry about it, you don't worry about it happening again, and you never have another one, it's not panic disorder. Right? And that happens. People that don't develop panic disorder might have a panic attack now and again. And you're like, wow, that's weird. And then that's it. So why do some people keep having them? And why do some people really worry about it and maybe change the way they behave because of it? Well, if we think about the diathesis stress models, first thing about the diathesis, the predisposition of vulnerability, if you will, could be a psychological vulnerability, right? Most likely related to how people think. Right? And this might involve catastrophic interpretations. Right? And this is where we talk about Clark in his 1986 model suggested that people are differ with regard to how they interpret bodily sensations. Some folks are prone to catastrophic misinterpretations of these sensations. Right? In that being prone to have that kind of misinterpretation may be associated with anxiety. Whenever you get a little bit scared, heart rate goes up a little bit, or just you're going upstairs and your heart rate goes up. Some people may be more prone to misinterpret that being, oh, something's wrong, my body's freaking out, right? And maybe those kind of typical, more kind of classical anxiety, type sensations, but also other sensations as well, like a hunger pain. Right? According to Clark, the misinterpretations occur at a very basic and perhaps even unconscious level. Right? So the idea that your body's doing kind of weird stuff all the time. You feel a little hungry, a little dizzy, heart rate goes up for a variety of reasons. Something you ate, some activity you did, you saw somebody who's attractive and that sped your heart rate up, whatever. And some people are prone to misinterpret that, and not in terms of, oh my goodness, I feel my heart going up, I think something bad is happening, but at kind of an unconscious, an unthinking, automatic level. That part of your mind misinterpreting the sensations. Support for this theory is found in the successful treatment of panic disorder that involves cognitive interventions that are aimed at challenging people to think differently about their bodily sensations. Right? So if you teach people to be mindful of their bodily sensations and talk about what they mean and what they don't mean, okay, when you feel yourself feeling this, here's what you say. Here's the thought you feed to yourself. Right? In doing that, for some people, helps reduce future panic attacks and also reduces the anxiety about having a panic attack. Okay? So because that works, think, well, maybe thinking that way was the problem, which is kind of some backwards reasoning, not necessarily true, but it's some evidence. Right? As we talked before, anxiety sensitivity again may play a role. An alternate cognitive vulnerability is anxiety sensitivity, and according to this view, some people are just more reactive to low levels of anxiety because of a fear of fear. Right? So it's not just the bodily sensations that are being misinterpreted, but some people are just more afraid of being afraid, and they don't like being anxious. And if you don't like being anxious, this is going to make you more anxious that you're anxious, and then it's going to spiral up quickly. Another idea about why some people might be more vulnerable is that those with a poor sense of control. Right? According to Barlow, people who feel that they have little control over whether or not bad things happen might be more prone to panic disorder. And he further theorizes that this diminished sense of control develops over time based on experiences of being helpless. So the idea being that people that have bad stuff happen to them and they can't do anything about it begin to feel helpless and they don't have control, and it's that sense of loss of control that might make you more prone to panic. So you kind of like the body's hypersensitive to looking out for bears because so many bears have mauled you. Right? Again, metaphorical bears here. Sorry. So possible psychological vulnerabilities, but there are also potential biological vulnerabilities. I'm talking about things like neurotransmitter dysregulation. Okay? Obviously, something different is going on neurochemically with people who experience panic disorder. Right? Their brains are working differently. It's not clear if panic results from the dysregulation or if the dysregulation is simply the biological manifestation of panic. Right? So is it, okay, your brains are working differently and that's causing the panic, or is it something else that's causing the panic, and when you're panicking, your brain is working differently? It's hard to tell which is which, but we know the brain is working differently when people panic. In terms of the neurotransmitters that are probably involved with panic disorder, and most of this is based on drugs targeting these neurotransmitters seem to help sometimes. The likely suspects include serotonin, noradrenaline, adenosine, GABA, and CCK4. A second biological vulnerability is this thought about the suffocation alarm. So the idea that there may be a vulnerability related to the mechanisms we have, these kind of natural mechanisms that we have to alert us that we're suffocating. Right? If you're sleeping, somebody starts smothering you, you're going to wake up and your body does certain things. Right? The system is in place to warn the brain if you aren't getting enough oxygen. Right? If somebody suffocated you, you fell in the water, whatever. And the theory here is that people with panic disorder have too low a threshold for the suffocation alarm. Right? So it's that's why the system is going off, because the brain thinks they're suffocating. The evidence for this there is this kind of finding that people with panic disorder aren't able to hold their breath as long as people without panic disorder. So there's some evidence, again. And is that because they have a low suffocation alarm, or is it because when they hold their breath, it builds up these sensations and the sensations are uncomfortable? Hard to say which is which. So a couple of different things that could be the vulnerability, the diathesis. The last one I'll mention, genetics. Excuse me. Like everything else, well, everything is genetic, right? So everything about you was in some way shaped by the genetics you were born with. So if you're prone to panic, there's some part of that that is influenced by your genetics. How much of it is genetic? Oh, hard to say. It does tend to run in families, but not. It's not like, oh, if your mom mom and dad had it, you definitely have it too. Nowhere near that level of influence. But yeah, there's some influence. It does tend to run in families. And again, it's not the disorder runs in families, but these other things, and maybe the neurotransmitter dysregulation, maybe the suffocation alarm. There's something biological that's influenced by your genetics that might make you vulnerable. In terms of the stress, if we think about classical conditioning, it's been proposed as one mechanism by which panic reaction gets detached from real threats. The idea here is that there's some random false alarm, and maybe you think there's a mugger, but there's not. And then, so you think there's a mugger, and your panic system goes off because it's supposed to, but no, there wasn't a mugger at all. But in that situation, maybe there are certain thoughts or other stimuli that were present before you got scared, and these thoughts and other stimuli were previously neutral stimuli, but they become conditioned stimuli. They become a signal for, okay, right before I thought this, or right after I thought this, I had panic. And so when next time you think that, you have panic again, and you may not know what those triggers are, and that's why they're thought to be unexpected. So the idea here is that really they would be expected if you could just figure out what those triggers are. And people don't know what the triggers are because it was classically conditioned. And in classical conditioning, you don't have to know that, oh, there's the bell, it's time to salivate. It's more of an automatic reflexive response. Another theory is that there might be neuroanatomical changes. Right? It could be that repeated stressful experiences cause changes in the emotional regulating structures in the brain. Okay? Because whenever you're stressed, you have cortisol released, and it's a hormone. And chronic stress means chronic activation of certain pathways. And when pathways are activated all the time, chronically, they change, and the structures change. And having high cortisol levels in your body at all times for over a long period of time changes and often actually damages parts of your brain. Like stress is bad for you. It's physically bad for your brain. So given that, it could be that the emotion regulating structures in your brain become damaged by this chronic stress. And most likely this would probably involve a strengthening of the projection from the central nucleus of the amygdala to the brainstem sites, your kind of primal brain, which regulate cardiac and respiratory functioning. It's the idea that having lots of times where you legitimately maybe have some high stress, maybe even panic, the more you panic, the more likely you are that system like gets in a groove, right? To where it gets ready to go, and so then it's going to set off much more easily, and maybe when there's not really a threat there. Okay. Moving on now to generalized anxiety disorder, which is sometimes referred to simply as GAD. In terms of the DSM criteria, primary criteria is excessive anxiety and worry about multiple things for 6 months. Okay. So, how much worry is excessive? Well, there's some subjectivity there. And again, that's where clinical judgment comes in, right? So somebody that they just sent their kids off to college, and they're getting phone calls from their kid's roommate that oh, I think your child's doing drugs. Oh, and also they may lose their and the person who's the parent might lose their job next week, and they got a report back from the doctor that they've got a weird spot on their skin. They need to come in and talk about it. That person's going to be anxious and worried, probably, right? And probably even a lot of worry and anxiety wouldn't be excessive given that situation. So what's excessive depends on how much stuff they legitimately have to worry about. Okay, so it's kind of like given what they have to worry about, how much anxiety and worry do they have? I think that's not, and there's kind of this 6-month thing, because the idea that there are stressful times in people's lives. Whenever you may have just a boatload of anxiety and worry, but generally life has a way of evening out and things return back to not so bad. But if for 6 months or more, and for GAD really it's a very kind of chronic disorder. It's kind of thought of as kind of a lifetime, almost like a personality disorder type thing. This is people who are worriers. Well, they always worry. It's not, oh, for a year I really worried. No, it's I worry all the time. I've always worried. Okay, but still you have there for at least 6 months to make the diagnosis. And these individuals don't necessarily experience anxiety differently from non-diagnosed individuals, but they do experience more severe anxiety. If you round up people that say, oh, yeah, I worry a bit, and you round up people who meet criteria for who have been diagnosed with JD, you will see differences in how they describe how severe their anxiety is. Excuse me. But I think to me anyway, the key feature of GAD, what really sets it apart, because a lot of anxiety, it can be hard to tell how much is too much. The real thing that sets GAD apart from just somebody who has a lot to worry about is that it's difficult to control the worry. Right? This may be the essential feature that distinguishes pathological worry from normal worry. It's really about the person's perception of controllability. So if they feel that they can't control their worry, they can't say, well, some people say, oh, if I have to worry about, you know what, I'm gonna turn on this reality TV and forget about it for a while, or I'm gonna go on vacation, I'm gonna get away from my house, and I'm gonna forget about it for a week. And they can do that. Okay, if you can do that, then your worry is controllable. People with a GAD aren't able to do that, or they don't think they can do that. They don't think the strategies that you might suggest would help them not worry. Right? Well, if I go on vacation, I'm still going to worry. And they might do that. Might go on vacation and worry about, oh, okay, I wonder what's happening at home now. If I left it, maybe we got broke into. So there's worrying all the time about everything. To help kind of differentiate pathological worry from normal worry, we also include these physical symptoms. So anxiety worry is associated with 3 or more of 6 physical symptoms. Restlessness or feeling on edge. Being easily fatigued, because worrying all the time wears you out, right? So you don't have much energy, so you get tired pretty quickly. Difficulty concentrating, right? When you're worrying about stuff, it's hard to focus your mental energy on any other task. Irritability, right, which you know is a correlate of worrying. Muscle tension, and this is really probably another kind of cardinal feature of GAD. What really helps differentiate somebody who's kind of a worrier to somebody who's GAD. People who have GAD, have measurably more muscle tension than people without GAD. They are literally tense. Not just, oh, you seem like a tense person. Their muscles are literally tenser. Like they're always ready to go on edge. Right, and it shows up in their body. And having muscle tension is part of why you get self-fatigue, and also why you also have the last symptom of sleep disturbance. Right? Hard to sleep whenever you're tense and tight and worrying. No, we haven't talked about it yet, but many of these symptoms are very similar to the diagnostic and associated features of a depressive episode. Which, not surprisingly, we'll see a lot of overlap, a lot of comorbidity with GAD and depression. And some of that probably has to do with the symptom overlap, where difficulty concentrating counts toward both diagnoses. Right? And you really may have both, but sometimes one disorder may be more appropriate than the other. But we'll talk more about that when we get to depression. Okay. The focus of the worry is not confined to features of another Axis 1 disorder. Right? So, if you have PTSD and all your worry is kind of about the traumatic event, and that's PTSD. Right? If you have phobia, you're afraid of snakes, and you chronically worry about snakes all the time, and you worry about multiple things about snakes, seeing snakes, touching snakes, being bitten by snakes, that's still all about that one thing, and it's limited to specific phobia. You don't diagnose with GAD as well. Eating disorder, there's often anxiety about weight. But again, that's just an eating disorder. You don't add something else on top of it if some other disorder better explains it. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment. And again, what does it mean to be clinically significant? It means you, as a clinician, say that it's significant. Some people might have really high anxiety but function okay. And it might even be egosyntonic, where they're not bothered by anxiety. It's like, oh, I worry about stuff, but if I didn't, things wouldn't get done. It's good to worry. It's fine. Right, so there may not be much distress for some of these people, but if there's no distress, then there does need to be some impairment. Some other rule-out stuff. The symptoms are not due to a substance or general medical condition, or exclusive to other disorder, which is a bit redundant with D. So, people that are on methamphetamines who have hyperthyroidism might have some of these symptoms with the muscle tension, the irritability, difficulty concentrating. Like I said, so you have to rule that out. If they have major depression, and that really covers all these symptoms, then you might not also diagnose GAD. Sometimes, though, with depression and GAD, to figure it out if they have both, really what you do is you have to treat one. So if they seem to have depression and GAD, and then you treat the depression, right? So if you give them SSRIs and some therapy, focusing really only on the depressive symptoms. If the anxiety goes away, then you think, well, they probably didn't have GAD, that was just depression. But if the depression goes away, but they still have chronic worry, okay, then they had both. Right? So sometimes you can't figure the diagnosis out until you've begun treatment, which is another kind of important thing to keep in mind, that diagnoses are a work in progress. So given what I know about the person at this point in time, these are the labels, or this is the label that best describes their behavior. With always in the back of your mind, that's subject to change. Right? And it's subject to change because I might be wrong, it might need revising, but also the person might change. They might no longer meet criteria for this disorder or that disorder, or something else might crop up and now they meet criteria for some other disorder. Right? So diagnoses are a work in progress. Okay. Thinking about the experience of generalized anxiety disorder, onset and prevalence. Onset is gradual. Usually it's not a sudden thing. Most people have difficulty remembering a time when they didn't experience chronic worry. Like I said, it's kind of this personality thing. The fact that many people report always being this way has led some to conceptualize GAD as a characterological phenomenon, much like personality disorder. However, a significant portion of diagnosed individuals do report experiencing extended periods of being symptom-free. Okay. So they might think, oh, yeah, I'm a worrier. I've always been a worrier. But that one summer, things were going well, and I was fine. So even though they kind of see themselves as always being a worrier, many of them report these kind of long chunks of time where they don't worry. Okay. So it's chronic, but not every single day, all the time chronic necessarily. They might have these breaks from them. Although most folks with GAD have, like I said, always been worriers, the worry and the associated impairment might not rise to the level of diagnosis at the same time for everyone. Some research has suggested a bimodal pattern of onset, with people who have a later onset, which is typically after 20, possibly experiencing different levels of symptom severity than those with an earlier onset. More research is really needed to figure out if if it starts early versus starting later, if one's going to be more severe than the other. The jury's still out. In terms of prevalence, lifetime prevalence is between 1.9 and 5.4%, with the sex ratio of 2 to 1, women to men. So women diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder twice as often as men. Comorbidity, like I've already talked about, pretty high. Some estimates as high as 90% for lifetime comorbidity. Most commonly comorbid with other anxiety disorders like panic disorder, or mood disorders like major depressive disorder. So most people that have GAD don't just have GAD. They have GAD and then have something else, or at some point in their time will develop another disorder. Distinguishing it from normal worry. We've talked about this already a little bit, but the types of things people with GAD worry about tend to be pretty similar to those with non-pathological anxiety. Right? Although some researchers have suggested that people with GAD are more likely to worry about minor problems than other people. So, everybody who has trouble paying the rent worries about paying the rent. The idea being that people with GAD worry about paying the rent and also worry about, does the carpet I have look okay? Are people going to think it looks like crap when they come into my house? Whereas other people might not worry that it's not as big a deal as paying the rent. But again, like I said before, what really sets them apart is the perceived controllability of their worry, and then the number of things they worry about. They worry, they experience it as their worry as less controllable, and they report worrying about more things than people who just describe themselves as worriers and don't meet criteria for GAD. Distinguishing it from other disorders, GAD was once thought not to be a distinct disorder. Rather, it was seen as a pattern of anxious symptoms that developed in the course of other disorders. Distinguishing it from other anxiety disorders, GAD can be distinguished from other anxiety disorders based on the difficulty of controlling the worry. Right? Again, that's kind of that key feature of, okay, it's GAD, they can't control it. Interesting though, it can be difficult to distinguish people with GAD and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, on measures of anxiety and mood. They look similar on these measures. And some people with GAD even engage in behaviors to cope with their anxiety that on the surface may seem similar to obsessions. However, most clinicians can reliably distinguish between GAD and OCD. And the key here is probably the intrusive nature of obsessions in OCD. So in OCD, when you have these thoughts like, oh, the house isn't clean, I need to clean it, that thought is experienced as you don't want it there and it's coming in at you. Right? Whereas in GAD, you may worry about, oh, the house is a mess, people are going to think it's crap, I need to clean it, and you can't stop worrying about it, but it's not experienced as intrusive thought. It's more kind of egocentric. It's more consistent with the way you see yourself, and so it feels different talking to people, GAD versus OCD. Also, GAD seems to differ from other anxiety disorders on a physiological level. With other anxiety disorders, if we try to provoke anxiety, we try to scare people, they have a bigger than average physical reaction compared to people without anxiety disorders. Right? So somebody with panic disorder, you say boo, and they're going to have a bigger startle response than somebody who doesn't have panic disorder. Right? This is not true of folks with GAD. Right? You tell them boo, and they won't have a stronger reaction than somebody without an anxiety disorder. They seem to be restricting their physiological responses, right? That kind of chronic muscle tension and always be on edge really keeps them from, getting too jumpy because they're expecting it all the time. They're expecting to be scared, so they're less likely to have that big physiological scare response, right? Already in gear. Distinguishing it from a major depressive disorder, like I said before, there's a lot of overlap between GAD and MDD because both involve the experience of negative affect, right? Negative emotional feelings, but they can be distinguished by the low positive affect in major depressive disorder. So both have got a negative affect, but people with GAD can also be happy, right? They can go to a party and have a good time. They may be worried about stuff, but they can still feel good and feel happy. People with major depressive disorder, in a major depressive episode, there's a real absence of positive emotion. It's really hard to feel happy. right? So that can help you tell which is which. Some people have postulated that MDD will occur as a result of GAD, that always worrying and feeling unable to control things leads to a sense of learned helplessness, which then results in the depression. Maybe true for some people. Negative reinforcement of worry. And we've talked about negative reinforcement a lot with anxiety disorders. And the idea here is that worry is trying to serve some purpose, right? That worry is about focusing attention on kind of verbal linguistic thoughts to distract oneself from threatening images and or feelings, right? So they're, you know, pictures in your head or feelings you have about something that's going to happen or could happen, and it's scary, and to distract yourself from it, to deal with it, you think about it, right? You think about it in kind of this verbal way, like, oh, I'm really worried about that. You know, saying that to yourself in your head, these kind of verbal thoughts rather than the image thoughts or the more vague feelings, right? Excuse me. And by always thinking about bad stuff, you keep it from being so bad, right? Oh, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad. Then it doesn't feel so bad because you're preparing yourself, right? The problem is this prevents you from ever fully experiencing the real meat of your fear, the real thrust of that fear. And so it won't ever go away. Again, you're preventing that kind of experience. If you let yourself be afraid, you'll be afraid and then you'll get over it. The idea here is that worrying about it, worry, the worry keeps you from feeling the fear fully. It kind of spreads it out, diffuses it, but by diffusing it, it stays there all the time. Somebody afraid of being a failure as a student constantly worries about assignments and not getting grades. And by focusing on those details, you don't ever face the fear of a larger failure, which at some level is perceived to be so overwhelming that it would be dangerous to feel or experience those emotions. I couldn't handle it. This is kind of at an unconscious level again. I couldn't handle really facing this kind of existential question of what to do with my life, so I'm going to worry about these details and keep myself distracted. And by not having to deal with the really big bad thing, it feels good to worry. It feels good to feel a little bad. It's better than feeling this big bad. If that makes sense. Okay. The etiology of generalized anxiety disorder. Talk about biological vulnerability. Like everything, genetic predisposition probably involved. Most likely related to how you experience and respond to stressful events, right? Right? Because genetics are going to play a role in forming the structures in your brain that are activated when you are stressed, right? So how much cortisol is released, how quickly messages go to your brain, what other pathways there are, other parts of your brain that are activated during stressful times. All that stuff is influenced to some degree by genetics. And then secondary to that, neurotransmitters and brain structures, which are first influenced by genetics and then later influenced by experience, right? Because how your brain is shaped, the structures, what neurotransmitter pathways you have. You know, at one point it was influenced by genetics as the plan, but then experience begins to interact with how it's built at one point in time, and it continues being built differently. Right? The more stress you have, brain changes. The less stress you have, brain changes. But again, kind of the likely suspects again here are GABA, serotonin, neurotransmitters. The limbic system in terms of brain structures seems to be involved with GAD probably. But there's not much research establishing differences in kind of in how the brain looks on PET scans and stuff between those with GAD and those without GAD. So a lot of stuff is pretty hypothetical. In terms of psychological vulnerabilities, early experiences of uncontrollability. So bad things happen, you couldn't do anything to stop it. That puts people at risk for generalized anxiety disorder, right? Because the idea being bad stuff happened, I couldn't stop it. The world is a dangerous place. I have to be on edge, right? I have to worry because it's dangerous, right? And that kind of makes sense. Some of that insecure attachment to primary caregiver. Right? So if the primary caregiver wasn't able to reliably provide support and affection, That means you couldn't really count on them. So again, based on attachment theory, then you develop a sense of the world as a dangerous place, and a sense of others as unreliable and not safe, and a sense of yourself as being potentially helpless. Right? All that could be related to kind of this insecure attachment. Excuse me. And then in terms of disorder-specific vulnerability, an intolerance of uncertainty seems to be common among people with generalized anxiety disorder, maybe even more so than some other anxiety disorders. So people that aren't able to not know what's going to happen, people that just need to know what's going to happen, what's next, they might be at greater risk for, in particular, generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, moving on to obsessive compulsive disorder, looking at the DSM criteria. Either obsessions or compulsions. Pay attention to that first word that's underlined and italicized. Either obsessions or compulsions. Most people, when they think about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, think, oh yeah, it's obsessions and compulsions. And for many, many people, it is obsessions and compulsions. But diagnostically, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Okay, okay, so obsessions. Well, what are obsessions? Well, they're defined as recurrent and persistent thoughts, impulses, or images that are experienced as intrusive and cause anxiety. Right? So they recur, they keep coming back, they persist even though you try not to think them or see them, in their experience as intrusive. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm daydreaming about winning the lottery. That's not an intrusive thought. Right? You want to dream about that. But if you don't want to think about it and it keeps coming in anyway, then it's intrusive. Right? And it also causes anxiety. So it's not pleasant to have this thought or image keep popping up. Right? So it's not imagining the face of a loved one over and over. It's like, oh wow, look at that's nice. It's ooh, I don't stop it. I don't like that. It feels bad. Okay? Obsessions are not simply excessive worries about real problems. Right? So again, this is when we go back to sometimes on the face of it, hard to differentiate between OCD and GAD. People that have excessive worries about real stuff, about paying the rent, about their kids, about their job, or whatever, if they have excessive worry about real stuff and it's uncontrollable, that's not an obsession. That's just worry. It may be a lot of worry, maybe pathological worry, but it's not an obsession. Okay. The person attempts to ignore or neutralize the obsessions, so try not to think about it. We try to do something to make them stop, or make them at least not make you feel bad. There is recognition that the obsessions are the product of one's own mind. And the idea here is that reality testing is intact. You don't believe that the thoughts are being broadcast from aliens. So the thoughts are intrusive, but you know they're your own thoughts. They're not. You don't think they're being beamed in. If you do, then it's not OCD. Now we're looking at some type of psychosis, right? Some sort of schizophrenic spectrum disorder, probably. Okay, so those are what obsessions are. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors or mental acts that one feels driven to perform in response to an obsession, or, this is a big or, according to strict rules. Right? So frequently, compulsions are in response to an obsession. Right? The obsession causes anxiety, and to make it go away, you have to do something. Right? And the thing that you do is a compulsion. So repetitive behaviors like washing your hands, checking the door, going home, checking the irons off. Sometimes it's mental acts though, and this can be, counting a certain thing. One client that had to pray a certain number of times. That was the mental act that she felt driven to do. So often it's that, these repetitive behaviors, mental acts you feel driven to do in response to an obsession. And the second part, this or, is according to strict rules. And this is where people can have compulsions without obsessions. Well, a thought doesn't come in, but they feel that things have to be done a certain way. And it's not like oh, there's a right way and a wrong way to fold laundry. Like, oh, these shirts need to be rolled up because it's the right way. That's just somebody who's anal-retentive or maybe obsessive compulsive disorder, kind of perfectionistic and rigid. This is really where the rules may not even be sensical. Okay, where they're very strict rules, and it's still a repetitive behavior. So I have to do this over and over again. So I have to fold the shirt, unfold it, fold it again, unfold it, and then fold it again, and then I can put it away. And there's no obsession that preceded that. I just don't feel right if I don't do that. So there's anxiety that builds until I do the compulsion. So there was an obsession, but there typically was anxiety that preceded the compulsion. So may or may not be an obsession before it, but it's still repetitive and it's according to strict rules. And again, not somebody who likes things neat, but they're doing something over and over again. The compulsions are aimed at preventing or reducing distress or preventing a dreaded event. So again, it's either I feel bad and I want to stop feeling bad, or I know if I don't do it this way, I will feel bad, so I've got to do this thing. Or the other one, this is kind of interesting, preventing a dreaded event. And I had one client that had this where he had to do a certain thing, or he felt like his parents would die. And again, for some people, well, that sounds like almost like psychosis, but it's not, because reality testing is intact. These people, I know that if I don't do it, my parents won't really die, but it feels like it. It feels like it's true, so I'm going to do it, because then that feeling will go away. Okay. So making yourself feel bad, or keeping something bad from happening, and usually something catastrophic. Also, at some point, the obsessions or compulsions are recognized as unreasonable. Again, this is that idea that reality testing is intact. So at some point, you realize that you really don't need to wash your hands 10 times. Wash them, water, soap, water, dry them off. Do that again 10 times. Right? But it's not always. They don't always have to recognize it's unreasonable. But at some point they did, right? So if it's getting worse, and they're the other kind of anxiety-provoking events are increasing in their life, they may move past that point, and now they don't see it as unreasonable. They don't have to do this. But at some point in their history, they did think it was unreasonable. Otherwise, we can think maybe there's something going on related to psychosis. The symptoms of the obsessions or compulsions cause distress, or they're time-consuming, or they impair functioning. Excuse me. And for time-consuming, we're talking about more than an hour in a day. So if it's just, it takes me 15 minutes, I'm done, and do it once, doesn't quite meet criteria if it doesn't bother you or impair your functioning. But these are things that really take quite a bit of people's time. The content of the obsessions and compulsions are not restricted to another axis 1 disorder. Again, this is the whole thing where if some other disorder better explains it, then it's the other disorder. So if people who are starving themselves because they have a fear of fat, for instance, anorexia nervosa, if they're obsessing about food, which interestingly does happen with anorexia, and we'll talk more about that later, but there's this weird overlap of those two. But if it's that, then it's just anorexia nervosa. Okay? And it's not just because of a substance or a general medical condition. So somebody going through withdrawal who's obsessing about getting high again, and they can't stop thinking about getting high. Now that's a substance dependence problem, or certain medical conditions might lead to some strange behaviors. But again, if you can treat this medical condition, or if they have and the symptoms go away, then it was an OCD. It was this weird manifestation of a general medical condition. Last, you have the specifier, potentially with poor insight. So you don't always have to do this, but if most of the time during the current illness episode, when you're seeing them pretty much, if the person doesn't recognize that the obsessions and compulsions are excessive or unreasonable, then you add this with poor insight specifier. Again, so they may have, at one point in time, they thought they were excessive or unreasonable, but now they don't. When you're seeing them, you add this specifier. And research suggests that insight is a matter of degree that occurs on a continuum. So it's not yes insight, no insight. It's a level of insight. But to date, it doesn't really help you to know in terms of predicting treatment outcome. It doesn't help you know who's going to be successfully treated and who's not, if they have poor insight or they don't. Okay, regarding the experience of OCD, looking at onset and prevalence, talking about a 1.6% lifetime prevalence. That's what's reported. Maybe more than that. That's probably underreported. It's slightly more common in women than men, but the onset between onset is between adolescence and the mid-20s, but there are different peaks of onset. So most frequently, when onset starts, it's different for male and female individuals. For boys, adolescence is the most common onset for males, and for women, for females, early adulthood is more common. So if you look at children and adolescents, you're going to see more boys than girls having OCD. But then by the time you look at people in adulthood, there'll be slightly more women than men. Typically, it's a gradual onset. If untreated, symptoms will wax and wane, usually in relation to the experience of stress. So during greater periods of stress, when there's more stuff going on, they'll experience more obsessions and compulsions, or compulsions. Comorbidity. About 50% of individuals in clinical samples report comorbid conditions. Most often, another anxiety disorder or a mood disorder, like major depressive disorder. That's probably the most common comorbid disorder. About 2/3 of the people with OCD that have a comorbid disorder, they also have depression, which makes sense. It can be kind of depressing to have these obsessions and compulsions. Notably, although rates of comorbidity with tic disorders aren't really high, so it's not like most people with OCD have a tic disorder. However, tics are more common among people with OCD than people without OCD. Not full-blown tic disorder, but tics in general. And then many people with a tic disorder they're more likely to have relatives with OCD, and they're also more likely to have OCD than people in the general population. Okay. So there may be some sort of shared genetic vulnerability or pathophysiology related to tic disorder and OCD. So something similar going on there in how people's brains work, it seems. In terms of what are the common obsessions and compulsions, for obsessions, most common would be contamination fears, kind of that germ phobia thing. About 45% of people reporting that. Pathological doubting, did I leave the iron on? Did I lock the door? That kind of thing, 42%. Somatic concerns, health concerns, about 1/3. Need for symmetry, again, a little less than 1/3. And then after that, it starts to get more rare. Sexual or violent images being the next one. And clients often report having more than one type of obsession. And sometimes one obsession occurs more often with an individual and is rated as more disturbing or impairing to that client. And when that happens, you refer to that as their primary obsession. So you might note that in their file. Contamination fear, again, is the most not only the most common obsession, but it's the most common primary obsession. And then fear of harming self or others comes in second place as a primary. Common compulsions: checking, about 63%, cleaning, 50%, counting, 36%, and then after that, things like seeking reassurance, following rules or sequences. And again, it's common to have more than one compulsion. And the most common primary compulsions are checking and cleaning. Then note here that compulsions may not be necessarily observable behaviors. They include mental acts like counting, praying, other things like that. Okay. The relationship to stress. As I said, symptoms worsen when life stress increases. What about obsessive compulsive personality disorder, people who are just perfectionistic? We often use OCD kind of colloquially to refer to someone who's a perfectionist, and likes to have things a certain way. Oh, I know, I'm so OCD about this. Right? Kind of say it in an offhand way. No, you're not. Probably that's not what OCD is, right? OCD is obsessions and or compulsions. If you're kind of rigid and things need to be a certain way, it's possible that you're kind of perfectionistic. It's kind of a personality trait. If that personality trait becomes kind of dominant and leads to impairment in functioning, then it might be obsessive compulsive personality disorder, right? Which does not feature obsessions and compulsions. It's pathological perfectionism and kind of this rigid personality. Okay. So OCD and OCPD, different things. OCD has obsessions and or compulsions. OCPD does not. Okay. Um, Now for the next 30 seconds, I want you to not think about white elephants. Ready? Don't think about them. Try hard. Okay. Some of you may have been successful, many of you may not have been. And Richard Wegner has done a lot of research on thought suppression using this kind of prompt with subjects, and find that people often have a hard time not thinking about things that they're told not to think about. Right? So when you try to suppress a thought, you purposely not think about something, it becomes harder not to think about it. And before I said that, you probably weren't thinking about white elephants at all. So it's not like, oh, I need to think about white elephants. It wasn't a pressing concern for you. But once, for some reason, you feel that you shouldn't or can't think about it, you think about it more. And that may give you a little bit of insight, just the slightest glimmer into what it's like to have these kind of obsessions, where you don't want to think about it, but it keeps coming back. Okay. In terms of the etiology of OCD, biological vulnerability, like everything, genetics. So there's probably a genetic predisposition for anxiety, but not really OCD in particular. So somebody with OCD is pretty likely to have relatives who are anxious, but not necessarily to have OCD in particular, right? Which is interesting because we often think of OCD as being a very biological disorder, but yeah, it's not as clearly genetically linked, kind of overtly linked, as maybe something like schizophrenia. We think serotonin plays a role in the orbitofrontal cortex, largely because selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, the things that target serotonin, often help in treatment. Right? But there aren't any findings to support abnormal serotonin functioning in people with OCD. So they haven't been able to document that their brain works differently. It's too much serotonin, too little serotonin. But using this drug that targets serotonin does work for some folks. And the orbitofrontal cortex, like I said, is probably important for some reason. And we know that partially because in really severe cases, they may go and do a lobotomy where they destroy part of the structure as treatment, and it leads to a reduction in symptoms. In terms of psychological vulnerability, think of cognitive appraisal models. This is where you're trying to explain the experience of OCD based on individual differences in how you think about stuff. Let me back up for a second. So this may involve things like overestimation of a threat. Right? So one theory about what's going on with OCD is that the things that people with OCD obsess about reflect real and valid sources of worry, like germs. Like germs really are kind of nasty, and you could get sick if you touch certain things and then touched your mouth, right? But people with OCD, the thinking here is overestimate how much harm will come from the stimuli. And that's why they think about it so much, because they're misestimating how bad this thing is, how dangerous it is. Right? And this may be related to early experiences where they're told the world's a dangerous place, or that certain thoughts or feelings are unacceptable. And so when we think this, partially because we're talking to people with OCD, it's people that have intrusive sexual images or curse words. you ask them about the childhood, and they may tell you a story about, oh yeah, I cussed one time, my mom washed her mouth out with soap and said it was the devil. It was kind of fairly traumatic things. Which suggests that may play a role in kind of thinking, oh, these things are bad and I shouldn't do them. And again, when you think something you shouldn't do something, it's hard not to think it. But this type of evidence is all based on retrospective reports, people remembering when they were a kid. So we don't know how many people that have these kind of things happen to them go on to develop OCD. So it may or may not play a big role. Whatever. Also, many people experience occasional intrusive thoughts, right? So, especially when you're under stress, there may be things that you can't not think about, right? So it's not just having intrusive thoughts by itself. It's, oh, if you have intrusive thoughts ever, you have OCD. No, not really. That's fairly normative to have them sometimes, especially when stressed. But the idea here is that maybe people with OCD evaluate this intrusion more negatively, right? So maybe they have this kind of some perfectionism, which is kind of OCPD type stuff, where they think they should be able to control their thoughts, right? They're not able to say, oh, there's a thought, that's weird, and let it go. Like there's a thought, like, oh, bad, I shouldn't have that thought, get it out of my head, right? So they react to not being in complete control of their thoughts. This may play a role, right? Which again would lead to more negative affect or stress, which then leads to more intrusions, and then kind of spirals into OCD, maybe. Another appraisal difference that may play a role is the degree to which the person feels responsible for maintaining control of these things. Maintaining control of things related to the obsession. Some individuals with OCD score very high in measures of responsibility. They feel they should and ought to control things, right? That it's their fault if something bad happens. Right? So kind of a hyper responsibility, and that may be kind of related to those people that have the idea that if I don't do this, my parents will die. If I don't do this, the car will crash, because their sense of responsibility is distorted and inflated. So there are a couple of different cognitive appraisal models. There are also some cognitive deficit models. The main one here is that the idea that memory deficits lead to obsessions. So, and this is people that, did I turn the iron off? So people that really can't remember, that's what makes them obsess about it. It's an interesting idea, but really not a whole lot of empirical support for that idea. Okay, moving on to post-traumatic stress disorder. DSM criteria, starting with the first one. The person is exposed to a traumatic event in which both 1 and 2 were present. 1, they experienced, witnessed, or were confronted with an event or events involving actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. Okay, so there's a lot here, right? So you experienced it yourself, you witnessed it, so you saw something happen, or you're confronted with the events. And confronted with events, what does that mean? Well, it could mean listening to it on the news, having someone tell you about something horrific and traumatic. Okay. In person, it's happening to you. In person, you see it happening, or later you're hearing about it, dealing with it, processing it, confronted with it. Okay. So it involves actual or threatened. So bad thing was happening, or somebody threatened a really bad thing, and the bad thing could be death, could be serious injury, and then could be threat to the physical integrity of self or others. And some people say, well, what's a threat to the physical integrity of self or others? And how is that different than injury? And I think when they were crafting this criteria here, what they're trying to capture here are those instances of when your personal space is invaded in a really kind of violating way. That doesn't necessarily result in serious injury. Some instances of rape result in serious injury. Some don't. It depends on exactly what happens. But all instances of rape do involve a threat to the physical integrity of the self. Right? That's a violation of the body. So I think that's why that's in there, because that can be a traumatic event. They want to be sure and capture that, because that can and does often lead to development of symptoms which we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so you have that, and then 2, the response to the trauma. So when you're experiencing it, witnessing it, or confronted with it, your response involves fear, helplessness, or horror. And kids, we kind of change the role and say, well, it could be disorganized or agitated behavior, because then they might be able to tell us that they're afraid or helpless. But if we see that, they don't have it together, like they can't play, they can't take care of themselves, they have disorganized behavior, or they're agitated, they're just really on edge, then that counts for them. For this second criteria, it's not clear if these exact emotion responses are required, or if other intense negative emotional experiences during the trauma, like if you feel a lot of anger, or just a whole lot of sadness during the traumatic event, might also result in kind of this chronic post-traumatic syndrome. Right now, technically, you have to have these things, but is this criteria right? Researchers are looking at it, right? And it's also possible that some individuals who are desensitized and may be trained to suppress fear may not have an initial strong emotional reaction, but later develop PTSD anyway. And the thinking here is that oftentimes when the kind of traumatic event happens, maybe they don't have fear and helplessness, they're doing their job. Think about kind of soldiers, police officers, they're doing their job, bad things happening around them, and they keep going. They don't feel the fear, they don't feel the helplessness, they don't feel the horror. But then, so at that time, it's not traumatizing. They haven't experienced trauma yet. The trauma happens when they think about it later, right? When their adrenaline stops, they go home and they go, holy crap, what just happened? And they replay the events in their mind, and boom, that's when they're confronted with the trauma, and that's the traumatic event, right? Potentially. Which is interesting for a lot of reasons. One, if you can have some sort of intervention between when the shit hit the fan and when they think about it, you might be able to prevent the development of PTSD, right? And that would be pretty cool. Okay. Beyond that, the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one way, possibly more. For most people, it's a mixture of these things. Persistent avoidance of stimuli associated... Oh, sorry, back up. Okay, sorry. So persistent re-experience, which could include recurrent and intrusive distressing recollections of the event. So when you're remembering stuff, but it's not a flashback, you still kind of know where you are and you know it's a memory. But they're intrusive recollections, so you're not trying, I wonder what happened that day. It's you, the memories come in, you see something maybe, and you start thinking about it. Right? You still know where you are and you know it's a memory, but you're remembering and you don't want to remember. In kids, this can look like repetitive play related to trauma. So if it's a car crash and they keep banging cars together, that counts toward this kind of this re-experiencing symptom. Also could be recurrent distressing dreams of the event. And for kids, just bad dreams counts toward this because they're less likely to remember the content of their dreams. So we'll let that count if they have bad dreams after a traumatic event. Acting or feeling as if the trauma event were recurring. And this is where we talk about dissociative flashbacks. So this is beyond trauma. This isn't just intrusive memories of, oh, I'm thinking about it again. This is where you feel like you're back there when the thing happened and it's happening again. Which is probably one of the scarier symptoms to experience. Intense psychological distress at exposure to cues that symbolize an aspect of the trauma. This is where people who are really trying to hold it together and maybe they're not letting themselves have flashbacks and they may not even think they have a problem, but anytime there's something that reminds them of the traumatic event, their heart rate goes up like, geez, my heart rate's going up, what's going on? They may not even be aware that they're having this stress reaction, but their body is reacting as if they're kind of back in the trauma and gearing up for the scary thing that's happening. Right? sorry, I'm sorry. That's the psychological distress. But then another one is physiological reactivity on exposure to internal external cues. So that's the heart rate goes up. The intense psychological distress is getting upset, getting angry, right? Is a common one, or really sad, or really anxious. Those psychological responses to cues that remind you of the trauma, and then also could be physical responses. Okay, so you re-experience it in one or more way, often more than one. And then there's also persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with trauma, and numbing of general responsiveness, as indicated by 3 or more symptoms. And these are things like efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Don't want to talk about it. Don't want to think about it. And think about this: avoiding feelings associated with the trauma. Right? So however you were feeling related to that trauma, you don't want to feel that way again, because having the feeling reminds you of the trauma. Another one, efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. Inability to recall important aspects of the trauma. So here we've got some maybe kind of dissociative amnesia. Right? You can't remember things, and this is conceptually your mind protecting itself. That thing was so scary and frightening that I can't remember certain things. And it may be that, but it may also be whenever something really scary and frightening is happening, your amygdala is firing and your emotions are going blah, 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 blah. It makes it hard to encode memories accurately. Right? We think, oh well, really emotional memories are strong and they're vivid. No, they're not. Really emotional things are hard to remember. Right? You may talk about them a lot afterward, and then you may think you remember them accurately, but we frequently don't remember really emotional things well. Markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, withdrawing from the world. And you think, well, why is that? Not wanting to go bowling, how is that avoidance and numbing? Well, because you're not wanting to do things, because if you go out in public and do things, they may ask you about it. You may be reminded of it. So this is about withdrawing from the world because you don't want to feel bad. And I say, well, I don't want to feel bad. Okay, I'll just try to feel good. No, that's a lot of work. Easier and more realistic to try to not feel anything than it is to try to feel good. And I think you find that with a lot of clients, that it's easier to shut off your emotions, or just try to, than to try to make yourself feel happy. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. So again, pulling away from them and then feeling like they can't relate to you and you don't really want to relate to them. A restricted range of affect, so you're not expressing a lot of emotions. And again, that's because I'm pulling everything and I'm going numb, because it's easier than possibly feeling this pain and this fear and the anxiety related to the trauma. And the last one, kind of criteria that might count toward the avoidance and numbing, is a sense of foreshortened future. Well, I really don't think I'm going to be here that long anyway. And again, that's this kind of avoidance thing where I just have this feeling I'm going to die soon. And that gives relief. Well, I'm not going to be here that long, something bad's going to happen, and I just don't have this vague sense that I'm not going to be here, because then I won't have to worry about this trauma anymore. And that's why I think, unfortunately, sometimes you see people with PTSD engaging in risky behaviors, riding motorcycles super fast with no helmet. It's just the idea that, I'm not going to be here long, and maybe I even do some things to help maybe speed that up, and I can escape this scary thought that I'm really trying to avoid. Okay, and then the third thing, there's 3 main things here. So re-experiencing, avoidance, and numbing. And the third thing, persistent symptoms of increased arousal, is indicated by 2 or more symptoms from a list, which include difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, which again is kind of being on edge and always on the lookout for danger, and also an exaggerated startle response. Generally, people with PTSD have stronger physiological reactivity than others. If you scare them, they'll jump bigger and more, and the heart rate will go up faster. Okay. So those are the main things for PTSD, and then you have some other just kind of criteria to help you rule out from other stuff. The duration of the disturbance of all these symptoms is at least a month. Right? If it's less than a month, then we're looking at acute stress disorder. Okay. And you do that, you have this kind of duration thing, because when something horrible happens, something traumatic happens, you're likely to have some of these symptoms. But not everybody who has them right after the trauma will keep having them. Right? So you have acute stress disorder in order to have a label you can apply to people and get them some help. But with the idea being that, okay, I'm going to give them some interventions, but they may be fine pretty soon. But then after a month, if they're not fine, the diagnosis converts from acute stress disorder to post-traumatic stress disorder. And the threshold for ASD, acute stress disorder, is also lower. It's basically the same stuff, except for you just need one of those, one symptom from each of those three. So experiencing it in one way, avoidance or numbing in one way, and increased arousal in one way. So you have that acute stress disorder, so you can get people services, and a lot of people that have acute stress disorder go on to develop PTSD, but not all of them do. Right? Some people may meet criteria for acute stress disorder, and then after a month, for whatever reason, they stop having the symptoms. They've worked things out enough, and they don't meet criteria for PTSD. Also, some people who will eventually meet criteria for PTSD won't meet criteria for acute stress disorder. So within that first month after the trauma, they may not meet criteria for ASD. They may seem to be dealing with it just fine. Right? In that case, you have this delayed onset. It's fairly rare. Most of the times, people that are going to develop PTSD show some symptoms soon after the traumatic event. But it does happen sometimes. There are reports of that happening in the literature. And then last, the symptoms are associated with clinically significant distress or impairment. And given the nature of the symptoms, it's hard to imagine them not being associated with distress or impairment. Okay, again, so just kind of sum up PTSD. It's about a traumatic event and then post-event symptoms, where you experience trauma, you have avoidance and numbing, and increased arousal. Again, not everybody that experiences a traumatic event will have this kind of chronic symptom pattern, but a significant portion of people that develop traumatic events, or sorry, that experience traumatic events will develop these symptoms. Okay. The experience of PTSD, onset and prevalence. Looking at a lifetime prevalence around 6.8%, based on that's fairly old data. It may be higher now. Now, although men may be more frequently exposed to traumatic events, if you think about combat situations, at least historically, women are more often diagnosed with PTSD than men, almost 2 times as often. The symptoms, like I said before, are typically present shortly after traumatic exposure, but it can be delayed up to 6 months for that kind of delayed onset. Comorbidity, high rates of comorbidity. Not surprisingly, other anxiety disorders often precede PTSD, which suggests that being kind of anxiety prone puts you at risk for developing PTSD if you experience a traumatic event. And then things like alcohol abuse and depression often follow PTSD. So people that maybe aren't depressed before, but after something traumatic happens, then develop a substance use problem or a major depressive disorder. Which the depression, a lot of that I think you can relate to that avoidance and numbing. You know, people that try not to feel and pull back from other people are going to be socially isolated, and they're not going to have positive emotional experiences. And when you don't have positive emotional experiences and you're socially isolated, well, that makes you a prime candidate for being depressed, right? Impact on relationships is important to consider. It can be difficult and even scary for a partner of someone with PTSD. There is a heightened risk of partner violence when one member of a couple is diagnosed with PTSD, and so maybe not surprisingly, couple and family therapy is associated with better outcomes than when combined with individual therapy than just doing individual. So somebody has PTSD, they get individual therapy, we might be able to help them. We give them individual, and we also put the couple or the family in therapy as well. Much better chance for that individual to have a positive outcome. The family as well, because obviously they're getting therapy versus not getting therapy, but that individual PTSD, they're going to get better faster and more likely to get better if we're going to involve other people in the family. And a lot of it has to do with psychoeducation and explaining, okay, yeah, when they do this, they're pulling away, they're getting angry. It's not necessarily about you. It's not something you did. This is part of them dealing with this traumatic event. So it's explaining that, and then getting them teaching people ways to work out how to communicate their needs and their boundaries in healthy ways, and in safe ways. That's really important. Another kind of thing that's been proposed is the idea of separate memory systems. Right? That there different neural pathways are involved in processing and storing verbal memories and sensory memories. So the narrative you tell yourself of what happened is stored via one path in one place, and then the sensations of what you smelled, what you saw, what you heard, what you felt are stored in a different way and in a kind of different place. But that typically the interconnections between these pathways allow for a fairly seamless retrieval of memories. Right? So when you remember something, you can remember the story and how you felt and what you saw and what you smelled, and it all kind of goes together. And some people have proposed that perhaps during traumatic experiences, the pathways are overloaded. There's too much stimulation, too much brain activity, and the systems become disorganized. Right? People with PTSD that are asked to describe their traumas do indicate a greater degree of disorganization than other people that experience traumas. Right? So when we talk about tell them the story of what happened, the story that they tell is less organized if they have PTSD, if they don't have PTSD, and maybe even experience the same trauma. But the people that have PTSD, the story is different, and different in such that less well organized. Another thought is about overgeneral memory. So consistent with what we talked about, the individuals with PTSD seem to develop an overly general memory after the trauma. Memories are less detailed and less specific about other stuff. Right? This seems to indicate maybe an adaptive response, whereby the person's trying not to remember certain things, and therefore they're screwing up their memory system. And so their memory gets worse after a traumatic event because they're working so hard not to remember the traumatic thing. When you're working so hard not to remember that, it's harder to remember other things as well. In terms of neuroanatomical abnormalities, brain imaging studies and neuropsych testing, things like the Stroop task, suggest that individuals with PTSD experience a hypoactive medial prefrontal cortex. So hypoactive, less active. So the medial prefrontal cortex is firing less, people with PTSD, and also a hyper-responsive amygdala. Right? Again, the amygdala is all about that fear and rage. So it's responds with given less stimulation and responds more strongly. So one of those or the other, or maybe both, depending on which studies you read. But yeah, the brains do seem to be working differently. And again, it's not known if that difference is caused by the trauma, if it was pre-existing, but people with PTSD, the brain does seem to be working differently. Okay, talking now about the etiology of PTSD. What causes PTSD? Well, most simply, trauma causes PTSD, right? Without trauma, you can't have PTSD. But it is not so simple as, oh well, if you experience a traumatic event, you have PTSD. No, because not everybody that experiences a traumatic event will develop PTSD. So must be some other things going on, right? And two people that are side by side experience the same traumatic event, one develops PTSD, one doesn't. Why the differences? Well, a couple things. One thing that may be important to consider are characteristics of the trauma itself, right? Which here we talk about severity, duration, and proximity. So how severe the trauma is. So there's a traumatic event. Will it lead to PTSD? Well, how bad was it? Was it, there was a fire in one room in my house and it was kind of scary, or is it my house burned down, I was asleep inside and nearly killed? Okay, there's a different level of severity to the traumatic event, right? And then duration. How long was the person experiencing the trauma, the threat to self? And there's more evidence coming in now that kind of chronic stress, these kind of long-term threats, can cause PTSD. For a while, people kind of thought, well, it's this kind of well-defined, at one point in time, this thing happened, and that's the trauma, caused PTSD. Now we kind of know, no, people that are in these kind of super high-stress situations where they're always under threat can also develop PTSD. And we know this largely from the people working the road crews trying to clear the IEDs, where they never know when something is going to blow up. Right? So there's this constant threat, and something may not ever blow up, but they still may develop PTSD just from having that high level of stress under threat for a long period of time. And the longer the duration of the threat, again, that increases the probability of developing PTSD. And then proximity to the trauma, physical and psychological. When the towers fell in New York, afterward, they were trying to figure out who needed help for PTSD, kind of knowing people would. And the data that came in, when you mapped it, on a map of the city, it showed this pattern of people that lived closest to the towers had the highest rates of PTSD symptoms. And as you went out in kind of these concentric circles away from the tower, the rates of PTSD symptoms decreased. So the literal physical proximity to the traumatic event was related to how likely it was people would develop PTSD. But then psychological distance or proximity also plays a role. If say you witness something bad happening to somebody, being in an accident or whatever, if it's a stranger versus if it's a family member who you know and care about, there's a different level of psychological proximity to the trauma when you know them and when you don't know them. So having someone you know and love, something that happened to them, increases the likelihood of developing PTSD because of the psychological proximity. There are also intrapersonal risk factors, things about people. Some people may be more prone to experience trauma in the first place, because of their personality styles. People who score higher in extroversion are more likely to develop PTSD than those that don't. Right? This isn't that extroverts, they all are anxious. No, it's because extroversion is related to being high in sensation seeking, looking for something exciting and thrill seeking, and also people who are extroverts don't tend to be as inhibited by rules and prohibitions as introverts. So, if the sign says no swimming and no diving, most introverts are like, oh yes, okay, I'm sorry. Whereas an extrovert, maybe not so much. And so they're at greater risk because they're putting themselves out there and taking these risks of experiencing traumatic events, and therefore at a greater risk for developing PTSD. In terms of protective factors, higher cognitive functioning as measured by IQ scores seems to be a protective factor for people who have experienced a traumatic event. A variety of possible explanations for why that is. Nobody knows for sure. Most likely related to higher IQ related to higher verbal ability, so better able to explain to yourself what happened and integrate all that stuff into a cohesive memory. In terms of getting back to risk factors, people with pre-existing psychiatric disorders are more vulnerable to develop PTSD after experiencing a traumatic event. People that previously experienced other traumatic events, so maybe bad stuff happened, you didn't develop PTSD, and then by the third bad thing, okay, now the likelihood that you develop PTSD is going up pretty high. So trauma does seem to be somewhat cumulative, right? You can't just keep shaking it off. Another factor may be negative metacognitive appraisal, and then metacognitive, thinking about your thinking. Right? So when traumatic things happen, many people have reactions consistent with PTSD symptoms, like I said. And it may be that people who think about their experiences as indicating something bad about themselves, like, oh, I'm going crazy, I'm not strong enough, this shouldn't bother me, those people may be at greater risk of developing PTSD, right? Because they're negative metacognitive appraisal. They're thinking about their symptoms as being a bad thing. Versus people think, wow, yeah, I can't sleep, I can't eat, I don't feel like talking about this. Seeing that thing freaks me out. Man, that sucks, but it'll probably go away. And this is, yeah, most people would feel the way I feel. If you can't have those thoughts, less likely to have PTSD than if you think, oh, this is bad, this means something's wrong with me. And then another big one is the response during the trauma. If it involves dissociation, then we've got a pretty high risk of somebody's going to develop PTSD. So if, when the traumatic thing is happening, your mind checks out and you experience derealization, depersonalization, which again is kind of the mind's way of protecting itself. If that happens, pretty high risk of PTSD. And that is largely because you're more likely to dissociate if it's a more severe trauma. Right? The scarier it is, the more likely it is your brain's going to go, hey, I'm out of here. Okay, interpersonal factors, things between people, relationships. If we kind of think of interpersonally broadly being kind of social and ecological, people are more at greater risk for experiencing traumatic events if they live in impoverished environments with higher crime rates. Right, you're more likely to get mugged in an impoverished neighborhood than in an affluent neighborhood. Can happen in both, but the likelihood is different. Right, you have different levels of police concentration, that kind of thing. So that kind of puts people at risk for PTSD because, again, puts them at risk for bad things happening to them. After people have experienced a traumatic event, interpersonal factors that may play a role, level of social support. The more people that are there to support you and care about you, less likely it is you'll develop PTSD after a trauma versus people that are more isolated or not connected. So they may be around people, but not emotionally, psychologically connected to them, then they're pretty high risk. Whether or not they disclose the trauma, or able to disclose the trauma to others. So, like sexual abuse that's not disclosed increases the risk of PTSD. People who are able to find someone safe to tell that to, and who is accepting of it and comforting and a safe person, now we've decreased the risk of developing PTSD after that traumatic event. But if there's no one to talk to, risk goes up. Related to that, more generally, we talk about social acknowledgement. Seems to be important. That you need the world to acknowledge that something bad happened. And if they don't, or if they blame you for the trauma, we see higher rates of PTSD. And here's a lot of data based on the Vietnam vets having pretty high rates of PTSD, and thinking being that a lot of that has to do with the reaction they got when they came home and being called baby killers and these kind of horrible things. So the horrible things happen to them, and they come home, and rather than being able to talk about it, about the bad stuff that happened to them, they were shunned and castigated and spit upon, which may have increased their risk. Biological risk factors. Like everything, genetics, again, probably in general a predisposition for anxiety, but then also genetics in terms of personality traits that are related to the likelihood of risk, like extroversion. There's some genetic influence there. Some evidence of people with PTSD having smaller hippocampi, a smaller hippocampus than people without PTSD. But again, not everybody. It's not fully consistent, and it's not always clear if that the small hippocampus was there before they had the PTSD, or if having PTSD and chronic stress led to a reduction in the size of the hippocampus because of the high levels of cortisol in their body for a long period of time. Okay. Adjustment disorder with anxiety. This is the last disorder we'll talk about. Excuse me. This is when you have an identifiable stressor. So something happens, not necessarily a trauma. It's not a traumatic event, but a stressful something happening or happened. Could be losing a job. Could be getting a promotion, getting a divorce, and then there are anxiety symptoms that develop within 3 months of this identifiable stressor. So it's not as though life is stressful, but there's something that clearly happened, and within 3 months of that, symptoms develop, and they are greater than would be expected given the stressor. So it's like, okay, well, somebody gets a divorce, you expect them to have maybe some anxiety, some sadness, but to meet criteria for adjustment disorder, it has to be greater than would be expected. Well, who decides how much is expected? You do. Use your clinical judgment with your full knowledge of the cultural reality of your client, which I'm sure you'll be 100% aware of. Symptoms cause impairment in functioning, so it causes a problem. But the impairment isn't sufficient to meet criteria for another Axis 1 disorder. So, everybody who has PTSD, could meet criteria for adjustment disorder, right? But we don't diagnose them with both because PTSD trumps, right? Because you meet criteria for another Axis 1 disorder, with these symptoms, you don't diagnose it twice. This can be a helpful diagnosis, though, for if you're working, private practice in the community or in a counseling center, where you may see people with less severe pathology, where just kind of something bad's happening, they have a tough time dealing with it in life. They may meet criteria for an adjustment disorder. And you can have, with anxiety, with depressed mood, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, or with kind of behavior problems, or kind of like conduct disorder stuff, where that's usually for kids that are acting out after parents get divorced, something bad happens, and it's thought to be kind of this brief thing that can be dealt with. Okay. A quick review of the causes of pathological anxiety that we've kind of touched on for all these different disorders. There are biological contributions. Neurotransmitters playing a role, with GABA being the one most frequently cited when we talk about anxiety. GABA is an antagonist. It stops things. Right? So the idea being that people with anxiety may have a deficiency in GABA. So you can't stop your worry because you don't have enough GABA. It's a very simplest way of looking at it. But as we'll see, serotonin and norepinephrine probably also important because drugs that target those seem to help. Brain circuits play a role. You've got the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is just, there are nerves that connect those different parts of the body, and it's activated during times of stress and anxiety. And the more it's activated, the more likely you are to be more anxious. Right? We know that that has an effect. The CRF, the corticotropin releasing factor hormone system, it activates the HPA axis. And there's also we talk about the BIS, the behavioral inhibition system. This is a system of brain circuits that gets input from the cortex and brainstem, right? So visual threats from the kind of the cortex, and then change in heart rate from the brainstem, your primitive brain. And again, just that idea that messages about anxiety often come from different tracks: fast track, slow track. The thinking about it, processing what is this thing, and the danger, bad, go, run. That part of your brain, and those don't always work on the same timeline. Right? The fight or flight system we've talked about a lot, with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system being activated by signals starting in the brainstem, right, which is that kind of your primal, lizard brain. It says danger, danger, do stuff, and then it's got but your brain will calm itself down. Let's talk about that. But we're still learning more and more about these brain circuits, and what we know about them, unfortunately, it's hard. It's hard to do experiments with people where you do stuff to their brains and see what happens. So what we know is largely from drugs that we think target these things, from some brain imaging studies, where we try to watch people's brains when they're anxious. But brain imaging studies are expensive. Anything about $1,000 a pop for an MRI or an EEG. You're not going to run 100 subjects through there to look at, let's see what happens when we make people anxious. Super expensive study. So there's just not enough data to be real confident about what exactly is going on and when it's going on. But evidence is emerging, and we're learning about what the brain looks like when it's anxious, and how the brain acts when it's not anxious, and how those things are different. There seems to be just a general vulnerability towards anxiety for kind of all the disorders we talked about. It's not, okay, well, if somebody in your family has this anxiety disorder, you're going to have it too. Well, if somebody in your disorder has an anxiety disorder, you're probably going to be more anxious than somebody who doesn't have a family member with an anxiety disorder. Right? So there's a general vulnerability for anxiety, which most likely has a genetic component, but also an environmental component. Maybe there's this kind of tendency to feel tense and be kind of hypervigilant for threats, and or maybe it's the just the discomfort with anxiety, the anxiety sensitivity. In terms of psychological contributions, we talked a lot about learned experiences, right? Learning theories, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, modeling. Talk about the control, right? Our confidence and our ability to control events in our lives seems to play a role in anxiety disorders. Both your need to control stuff and your confidence that you can control stuff, and kind of being confident that you can control stuff, that the world's a safe place, and that you're a person with agency, with power to change things. A lot of events that's related to early attachment experiences. And then the other big one is that tolerance for ambiguity, that cognitive component about whenever you're not sure what's going to happen, are you able to be okay with it? Are you able to go, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see? Or is it, I need to know. The more you can tolerate ambiguity, the less likely you are to be at risk for an anxiety disorder. Social contributions, obviously, stressful events can trigger vulnerabilities. Kind of think about this diathesis stress model. We think about stressful events sometimes being the stress part, but sometimes, think about this, the stressful event can create a diathesis. So somebody may not be that vulnerable to anxiety, right? They may have, have kind of positive psychological experiences with family and stuff early on. Nobody in their family has anxiety disorders. They have kind of this low genetic propensity for anxiety, but then they're put in a super stressful situation, and they experience a lot of stress. And when you experience stress, your brain changes. And so stress events can trigger vulnerabilities, where there's vulnerability there and it triggers it, or stress events could cause or create vulnerabilities. Right? So the take-home message here is try to reduce your stress. Take care of yourself. And encourage your clients to do that, because stress really is damaging. It's not just, it's just stress, you'll be fine, get over it. No, you need to address it. You have to do stuff about it, because it changes the way your brain works, changes the way you think, changes the way you feel. and that we have plenty of strategies to help people deal with that. So we should be sharing those. Okay, that's